Jesus used clay here is why it terrified authorities. The forgotten gesture behind the miracle in the first seconds of this story. A single question must echo in your mind. Why would a divine teacher choose something as humble as saliva and clay to perform a miracle? Not light from the heavens, not thunder or fire, but earth mixed with breath. This detail, recorded carefully and preserved through generations, was never accidental. In a world where symbols carried more weight than words, every gesture taught a lesson. When Jesus healed using saliva and clay, he was not merely restoring sight or flesh. He was activating a language older than temples, older than scriptures, older than empires. Two ancient minds. It was origin. Humanity itself was formed from dust shaped by divine intention. Saliva, on the other hand, represented life force, breath made visible, essence flowing outward. When these two elements met, creation was being reenacted in real time. This was not spectacle. It was instruction. Those watching were meant to remember something they had forgotten. Healing is not separation from the material world, but reconciliation with it. The hands that mixed clay were teaching that the sacred does not reject the physical. Instead, it redeems it. Yet over centuries, this act was simplified, reduced to a miracle story, stripped of its initiatory meaning. Systems of control preferred wonders without understanding, faith without memory. By removing the symbolic depth, the ritual became harmless, empty of its transformative power. But in ancient traditions, such acts were never random. Earth, moisture, intention, and touch formed a complete cycle of restoration. This was knowledge passed orally, protected from distortion, until only fragments remained. What looked simple was in fact dangerous to rigid hierarchies, because it reminded people that divine power could move through the most basic elements of life. No intermediaries. No elaborate structures. Just earth, breath, and alignment with sacred order. The question is not why he healed this way, but why later generations were taught not to ask what it meant. Clay, breath, and the law of restoration to understand this ritual. One must step back into the mindset of the ancient world, where healing followed laws, not impulses. Clay was associated with form, structure, and limitation. It represented the body itself, fragile yet purposeful. Breath, carried through saliva, symbolized animation, consciousness, and divine spark. When these were combined, the message was unmistakable. Restoration happens when spirit and matter are correctly aligned. This principle existed long before religious institutions. It was embedded in creation narratives, agricultural cycles, and early healing practices. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was impure by default. By applying clay to the eyes, Jesus was not only addressing physical blindness, but revealing a deeper truth. Perception itself can be healed. Sight, in ancient understanding, was not merely optical. It was spiritual discernment. The ritual acted as a mirror, showing that what appears broken may only be disconnected from its source. Over time, authorities became uncomfortable with this implication. If healing could occur through simple elements guided by wisdom, then power did not belong exclusively to temples or elites. So the narrative was reshaped. The action remained, but its meaning faded. The ritual became an exception instead of a principle. Yet those who understood the old ways recognized the pattern immediately. Earth receives intention. Breath activates potential. Touch completes the circuit. This was restoration according to natural law, not rebellion against it. The act reminded observers that the body was not an obstacle to holiness, but its vessel. By honoring clay, the teaching restored dignity to the material world, countering systems that thrived on separation and fear. This was not secrecy for mystery's sake. It was protection from misuse. Knowledge like this was meant to be lived, not exploited. When stripped of context, it appears strange. When restored to its roots, it becomes inevitable. The ritual did not contradict faith. It completed it. And once this pattern is seen, it becomes impossible to unsee how much was deliberately left unexplained. The alchemical pattern hidden in plain sight, when examined through the lens of ancient knowledge, The act of healing with saliva and clay follows a precise pattern that was well known to initiates of sacred science. Alchemy, in its original meaning, was never about turning metal into gold. It was about restoration, balance, and the elevation of what had fallen out of harmony. Earth and moisture were foundational elements in this process. Clay symbolized the prima materia, the raw substance awaiting transformation. Breath, expressed through saliva, represented the activating principle that awakens dormant potential. Combined, they formed a living formula understood across civilizations long before formal doctrines existed. This is why the ritual appears so understated. True alchemy was never theatrical. It worked quietly, in accordance with laws that governed both body and soul. By repeating the act of creation itself, the healer was demonstrating that disorder can be reversed by returning to origin. This threatened later systems that relied on distance between the divine and the human. If restoration could occur through alignment rather than permission, authority weakened. Over time, symbolic acts like this were preserved as stories but emptied of their instructional value. The ritual remained visible, but its keys were hidden. Observers were taught to admire the result while ignoring the method. Yet in ancient traditions, method was everything. Nothing was improvised. Every element, every motion, every substance carried meaning passed down through generations. The application of clay to the eyes was not chosen randomly. Eyes represented awareness, direction, and truth. To yield sight was to correct orientation toward reality itself. The act revealed that confusion and blindness were conditions of imbalance, not punishment. Alchemical restoration did not judge. By maintaining the ritual without explanation, later interpreters ensured it could not be replicated, only revered. This preserved hierarchy and dependence, but beneath the surface, the pattern remained intact, waiting for those who still understood the language of symbols. Earth receives form. Breath transmits life. Touch seals intention. This sequence appears again and again in ancient healing texts, temple rites, and oral traditions. What was shown publicly was never meant to be reduced to spectacle. It was a living demonstration of natural law, disguised as simplicity. The danger was never the ritual itself, but the memory it awakened. Why this knowledge became dangerous as traditions became institutionalized. Teachings that empowered individuals to understand natural law were gradually knowledge that once served restoration began to threaten control. The ritual of saliva and clay implied something unsettling to rigid structures. Divine action could flow through ordinary matter without intermediaries. This challenged systems built on exclusivity and fear. If the sacred could move through earth and breath, then holiness was not confined to altars or offices. It was accessible, embodied, and immediate. Over generations, this implication became unacceptable. So the narrative shifted. The act was preserved as a miracle, but miracles were redefined as exceptions rather than demonstrations of principle. By doing so, understanding was replaced with awe. Awe requires submission, not comprehension. The original teaching, however, demanded responsibility. It reminded observers that disorder persists only when alignment is lost. Restoration follows law, not favoritism. This idea eroded dependence on authority figures who claimed exclusive access to divine power. As a result, symbolic literacy faded. Rituals were detached from their roots. Words replaced gestures. Doctrine replaced experience. The demiurgic mindset, focused on separation and hierarchy, thrived under this model. Mata was framed as fallen, suspect, or corrupt. Yet the clay ritual directly contradicted that narrative. It affirmed that Matha participates in redemption. Earth itself cooperates in restoration. This was not convenient theology. It dissolved artificial boundaries between sacred and profane. Over time, teachings that reinforced separation were amplified, while those that restored unity were quietly sidelined. The result was a tradition rich in language, but poor in memory. The act of healing with clay survived because it could not be erased, but its explanation could be buried. When people no longer understand why something works, they stop asking how it might work again. This was the true containment strategy. Not censorship, but simplification. By preserving form without meaning, repetition replaced transmission. Yet traces remain for those willing to look backward instead of forward. to value ancient continuity over modern reinterpretation. The ritual stands as a silent witness to what was once openly known. Restoration does not come from domination over matter, but cooperation with it. And any system that depends on separation will always fear a teaching that reunites what was divided, the demiurgic veil, and the loss of memory. As centuries passed, a subtle but decisive shift took place in how spiritual knowledge was framed. The world began to be explained through division rather than continuity. Spirit was elevated, matter was diminished, and the human being was positioned as dependent rather than participatory. This worldview, often described as demiurgic in nature, did not deny the divine outright. Instead, it filtered it. Creation was portrayed as flawed, distant from its source, requiring constant mediation. Within this framework, the ritual of saliva and clay became problematic. It contradicted the narrative that matter was unworthy or incapable of carrying sacred force. The act implied that creation was still responsive, still aligned with its origin, still capable of restoration from within. This was not compatible with systems that thrived on estrangement. Over time, emphasis shifted toward belief over practice, confession over correction, and obedience over understanding. Symbolic actions lost their explanatory power and became ceremonial remnants. The original memory of why these acts worked was replaced by reverence without insight. The demiurgic veil did not erase truth. It obscured Italiano. By encouraging abstraction, it disconnected people from experiential knowledge. Healing became something granted, not something enacted through alignment. The clay ritual survived in text, but not in teaching. Its presence became a curiosity rather than a doorway. This loss of memory was not sudden. It unfolded gradually, generation by generation, as oral traditions weakened and symbolic literacy declined. What once required to lived understanding was reduced to interpretation. The body, once seen as a partner in restoration, became a problem to overcome. Yet the ancient message never disappeared entirely. It lingered beneath the surface, encoded in actions too simple to fully suppress. Earth and breath remained. Touch remained. Intention remained. The ritual continued to testify silently that creation was not abandoned. The veil worked, not by force, but by distraction. When people stop recognizing symbols, symbols lose their power. But when memory returns, even partially, the old coherence begins to reassemble. The ritual stands as a reminder that forgetting was taught, not inevitable. Restoration as alignment, not exception in the ancient worldview. Healing was never understood as a violation of natural order. It was its fulfillment. What appeared miraculous was simply alignment restored. When Jesus healed with saliva and clay, he demonstrated this principle without argument or explanation. The act itself was the teaching. By working with basic elements, he revealed that restoration does not require escape from the world, but correct relationship with it. This stood in sharp contrast to later interpretations that framed healing as rare intervention. In older traditions, imbalance had causes, and correction followed law. Blindness, whether physical or perceptual, signified disconnection. The remedy was not punishment or pleading, but reorientation. Clay represented form returned to its proper function. Breath reintroduced vitality and awareness. Touch completed the reconnection. Nothing supernatural was added. Nothing artificial was imposed. The process honored what already existed. This understanding empowered responsibility. If disorder resulted from misalignment, then restoration required participation. This idea was quietly replaced by narratives that emphasized helplessness. Faith became passive. Expectation replaced engagement. Yet the ritual itself refused to conform to that narrative. It remained stubbornly physical, stubbornly simple. It insisted that matter listens, that creation responds, that healing is not foreign to the world, but native to it. By reenacting creation on a small scale, the act reminded observers that the same principles that formed humanity still operate. The body was not bypassed. It was addressed directly. This perspective dissolved the false divide between sacred and ordinary. Eating, breathing, touching, and shaping were all part of divine order. Over time, this coherence was fragmented. Teachings were separated from lived experience. Restoration became symbolic rather than practical. Yet the original message remains recoverable. Healing as alignment does not belong to a specific era or authority. It belongs to the structure of reality itself. The ritual of clay and breath continues to communicate this truth without words, waiting for recognition rather than reinvention. What this ritual still teaches today, even now, this ancient act carries instruction for those willing to observe it without modern filters. It teaches that simplicity is not weakness, and that what is humble often carries the deepest authority. The use of saliva and clay reveals continuity between origin and restoration. What formed humanity is what restores it. This challenges the habit of seeking solutions exclusively in abstraction, complexity, or distant power. The ritual points backward, reminding that wisdom once moved through daily life, not separate from it. It also confronts the idea that knowledge must always progress forward to be valid. Some truths are preserved by returning, not advancing. By valuing ancient continuity, the ritual resists reinterpretation that strips it of coherence. It asks the observer to reconsider assumptions about matter, body, and participation. Healing is shown not as spectacle, but as correction, not as permission, but as principle. The demiurgic framework depends on fragmentation. This ritual demonstrates unity. Earth cooperates with breath. Intention guides form. Touch completes order. These are not metaphors, they are patterns. When forgotten, systems fill the gap. When remembered, dependency dissolves. The ritual does not demand belief. It demonstrates structure. Its endurance across centuries is not accidental. It survives because it aligns with reality itself. Even when misunderstood, it cannot be fully erased. The act continues to whisper that creation is responsive, that restoration is lawful, and that separation was never the final condition. For those who value the past, not as nostalgia, but as foundation, this ritual offers orientation. It reminds that wisdom was once embodied, not outsourced, and what was embodied can be remembered. If this teaching revealed something long forgotten, engage now. Share your interpretation in the comments. Question what you were taught to overlook. And subscribe for the next chapter where ancient symbols regain their original voice through continuity, not reinvention.